And I couldn't believe it that for the second week in a row, I was poured toward what Paul was talking about. What's happening to me? But there's some real value in what Paul says here. In verses 2 through 4, he writes, one person believes in eating everything, while the weak person eats only vegetables. Those who eat must not look down on those who don't, and the ones who don't eat must not judge the ones who do, because God has accepted them. Who are you to judge someone else's servants? They stand or fall before their own Lord, and they will stand because the Lord has the power to make them stand. The Jews in this day and today still, they avoided eating meat that they considered to be unclean, okay? Anything that wasn't kosher. And I mean, growing up in Rockbridge County, I thought that kosher just meant everything was good. I've learned a lot since then. Kosher means that the meat, first of all, it's considered to be okay to eat. But aside from that, it's typically a rabbi that does some sort of blessing over it, and that means that it's okay to consume because it is clean. But if someone doesn't have access to kosher meats, to be faithful to their tradition, to their religion, they might just depend solely on vegetables. In the book of Daniel, in the Old Testament, if you guys are familiar with that, when Daniel and his friends were exiled to Lebanon, he asked, please only put vegetables on my plate, because the meat in Babylon was not kosher. In trying to be faithful to God, as Daniel perceived God, he thought that this was something he had to do. Now, Paul, he was writing to the church in Rome, which was more Gentile than Jew, let's be honest. And the Gentiles considered pork, which is not kosher, to be one of the most delicious foods on the planet. And I've been a vegetarian for 4 years, but I remember what bacon tastes like. I remember that, and it was good. But the Jews did not partake because they viewed it as being against their covenant that they made with God. And the Jews were often mocked for not partaking of this bacon. And there was a time when I would have made fun of a vegetarian for not eating bacon, because bacon is wonderful. But Paul says that we are not to judge each other based on our diets, especially when those diets are one of the things that we perceive as being faithful to a promise, to a covenant that we have made with God. I'm a vegetarian now simply because I don't like to eat animals. I don't have to. There's a Kroger right across the street. And on a more spiritual level, I just have this conviction that it's not something that helps me grow spiritually to take the life of something else. But that's not a judgment on anyone who chooses to partake of meat. If you like it and it works for you, have at it. But the point is that there's no judgment either way. Verses 5 through 6 says, one person considers some days to be more sacred than others, while another person considers all days to be the same. And each person must have their own convictions. Someone who thinks that a day is sacred thinks that way for the Lord. Those who eat, eat for the Lord because they thank God, talking about eating meat. And those who don't eat for the Lord, and they thank the Lord too. You do what you do for your own reasons. Now, the Romans, they love to party. They loved to party, and they had festival days galore where they would celebrate with food and drink. All the time there was something else that they were celebrating. But the Jews were different. The Jews did not partake in the Roman festival days, but they did take one day out of the week to observe as the Sabbath, to keep it holy, to take a day of rest, and to spend that time in communion with God. Now, Despite the many festival days that the Roman Gentiles would take off to participate in these festivals, they still considered the Jews lazy for taking one consistent day a week. It was all a matter of perception. And this Roman church was divided because of the customs between the Jews and the Gentiles. Because some of the customs they had come to view as being sacred. And if someone seems to be doing something that violates your sense of the sacred, it can be hard to get past that in our own minds. And even amongst the Jews, there was disagreement over which day they should take as the Sabbath. Okay, they couldn't even agree within the community within the community of the Jews, which day do they take as the Sabbath? And that divided them even more. It caused more division. And the bottom line with this is that there may be others who don't hold the same things as sacred as we do, but that doesn't mean that the things they value aren't sacred as well. Now, verses 1 and 10, I put those two together. It says, welcome the person who is weak in faith, but not in order to argue about differences of opinion. Why do you judge your brother or sister? Or why do you look down on your brother or sister? We will all stand in front of the judgment seat of God. Why are we always so quick to judge one another? I'm guilty of it too. No judgment here. But we are always so quick to jump to that. And as believers in God and followers of Jesus, we are called to live in community, to live in fellowship with one another, and we're called to lift each other up, not put each other down. Gospel living, it's a constant challenge to us to disrupt the status quo, to step outside of our comfort boundaries, our comfortable boundaries. We are called to step outside of those, to push the boundaries of our comfort zone to meet people on the other side. We need to listen and learn from people who have different perspectives. And as people, we're often tempted to hang around like-minded people. And there's something to be said for taking refuge inside our comfort zone from time to time. No one can be on the front lines of the good fight all the time without burning out. You can't do it. We're human beings. We're not meant to do that. There is nothing wrong with coming in and enjoying fellowship with like-minded people, people who are on the same Christian mission as we are. But we can't do that constantly because it limits us. It limits the power of the gospel, the transformation that the gospel can achieve when we share the true love of God with people who don't really know about it. And we're transformed too in that experience. Paul insists that we receive into community those who may be weak in faith, or those who see things differently. And we don't want to engage those people in debate, but, because if you're debating with someone, you're trying to change them. And yeah, that might be a goal because, again, we are human and we're thinking that we're right? But instead, we need to embrace all people as equals in God's eyes. And I've been around this church for a while now, and you guys have this pretty well in hand. You just don't tolerate those who have doubts in their faith or who see things differently, but you show them hospitality, and you go out of your way to make them feel welcomed. I've seen this time and time again. Yesterday in our Radical Conversations group, the question was raised, how would we as a church treat a fundamentalist who walked through our door on Sunday morning? Now, a fundamentalist, well, there's a lot of ways I could describe a fundamentalist, but the nuts and bolts of it is that they believe that the right way to be a Christian is to rely solely on the texts of old and interpret them literally. When in general, we think that the right way is to believe that God is revealed anew with each generation. And the general consensus of the group was that, though we would lavish welcome upon this person like we would anyone else, that the fundamentalists would probably run out pretty quickly once they realized that we weren't the tribe that they were looking for. We don't hold the same viewpoints that they would. But what if they didn't? What if they stayed? How can we deal with conflict when we as people have become so incredibly polarized in our viewpoints? Paul addresses this in verses 7 and 9. He says, we don't live for ourselves and we don't die for ourselves. If we live for the Lord, and if we die for the Lord. Therefore, whether we live or die, we belong to God. This is why Christ lived and died, so that he might be Lord of both the dead and the living. What I see Paul is arguing here is that people can and do hold radically different convictions of what it means to follow God, what it means to know God. But they're all just trying to serve God in the way that they know how. And there's always good people on either end of whatever spectrum you want to put them on, because in the end, the only reason we're on different side of a spectrum is because we see God in different ways. We can either see God as a judgmental parental figure who's going to crack the whip, or we can see God as someone who is gracious and forgiving. But whichever way we see God, that's going to determine how we feel like we can best serve them. Now, we might see the other side as being misguided, but we have to resist demonizing one another. And I'm preaching to myself so hard here. We have to resist putting labels on the other side. We have to resist the temptation to say that they are beyond help or that they will never listen. Because in order to get them to listen, we have to start by respectfully disagreeing. We have to show respect, and we have to be willing to lay down our own weapons and come to the table and try to figure out why the other side thinks the way they do. It's much easier to demonize a group of people than to hold someone that you know personally in judgment. Someone who, despite their different thoughts, enjoys the same movies as you do, or has a kid that goes to the same school. We all have more in common than not. It's just a few of our ideas of how we need to do things that separates us, but it's a minority of a person. As people, as whole people, we have much more in common than not. And we have to find out why the other side feels the way that they do, because once we get down to the root of our thoughts on both sides, what we're going to find out is that there are no sides. There are no sides because we are all one people. We are all God's people, despite the fact that we disagree on who God is or how it's best to serve them. We are all God's people, even the ones that drive us crazy. Now, the final theme of the text for this morning is accountability. Verse 11 quotes Isaiah, the prophet Isaiah, where he says that every knee shall bow and every tongue will praise God. And he's referring to the great day of judgment, the day of the Lord. They bring it up a lot in the Old Testament. And verse 12 says that we will each give an account of ourselves to God. Now, the day of the Lord was where God was going to come and set everything right. Okay? Everything that's wrong in the world, God was going to make it right. Everyone who's oppressed, they will not be oppressed. Now, growing up in a fundamentalist church myself, it was verses like these that would make me so incredibly scared that I wasn't measuring up to the standard that the church had set for a good Christian, which was essentially a perfect person, which no one is capable of being. And on this judgment day, everyone in all of creation would be gathered to witness. And I imagine that there would be this big movie screen and popcorn where everyone's lives and everyone's sins would be broadcast for all the world to see. And if you have anything that you're ashamed of, your shame would be broadcast. Your sins would be broadcast. Your trauma, the things that you did to cope with your trauma, would be broadcast in front of everyone. I cannot begin to think that the God that I picture would do something so cruel. I think that God is much more gracious and forgiving of all of us. And that the judgment will be when I stand before God to tell them what they want to know and to be held accountable as a living, breathing soul that came from God in the first place. And this reckoning, it's nothing to fear. It's nothing to fear. It may be that if I don't measure up, that I would have to go through some sort of purification or transformation, and though it would be intense, it wouldn't be forever. I liken it to a class in school, okay? You go to school, which is this life, and if you do well in class, if you do well in this life, then you won't have to have the final exam because you have learned what you came here to learn. And if you didn't do well, then you got to take that exam because you didn't learn what you were supposed to learn. And the exam, it's for your own good. It is for your soul to be made complete. It is for your soul to learn the lessons that somehow we didn't quite get in this life. And to me, that's not really judgment. Yes, God will judge whether or not you have to take part in this, but it's not punishment. I guess that's what I'm getting at. It's not punishment. It's for our own good. It's for our soul's own good, so that when we leave from this earth, we can again be united with the soul, with the spirit that is God. And in this conversation with God, there might be popcorn, but I don't think it's going to be a big broadcast. I don't think it's going to be in front of everyone. I think it's just going to be a one-on-one between me and God, between you and God. And I think that there's only going to be one question that they're going to ask me. And that question is really going to sum up the way I lived my life. And the question I think that God is going to ask me and everyone else is just this: how did you love? How well did you love your neighbors, both those that you know locally and those globally? How well did you love those people that you perceive to be your enemy when really they're just your brother or sister? Siblings have squabbles. How well did you love during your time here on earth? That's all God's going to want to know, and God already knows the answer. To love as well as we can, we have to let go of the hurt that happens when we come up against someone who is oppressive, who is angry towards us for being who we are or for thinking the way we are. Because their perception of God and their perception of the best way to serve God, and their belief in their traditions and the text of the Bible, and it being literally interpreted, that's not something that just happened to them overnight. That is a lifetime of molding this person to be who they are. And the best way to get through to that person is to be kind, is to show them love, is to ask them to expand on what they are saying. Why do you think this? Why do you believe this? Tell me about it. Get them off of the defensive and let them get to know you as a person, and you get to know them as a person, beyond the anger, beyond the divisiveness, so that we can say that we loved very, very well indeed. Amen. Is it hot in here?